Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into the world of startups.
Always exciting.
And to guide us, we've got some pretty unconventional wisdom from Paul Graham.
Ah, Paul Graham, a legend in the startup world. What have we got from him today?
Well, it's not your typical business advice. It's more like the kind of no-nonsense stuff he'd probably tell his own kids about navigating the wild ride of startups.
I like it already. Straight to the point.
Exactly. And he's got this really engaging way of getting his point across. Think humor, personal stories, maybe even a few words you wouldn't hear in a typical board meeting.
Yeah, he's not afraid to tell it like it is.
Okay, so to kick things off, Graham actually compares starting a company to something totally unexpected, learning to ski.
That's an interesting analogy. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Right. And his point is that both require you to, get this, unlearn your natural instincts.
Unlearn your instincts. So it's not about just following your gut.
Well, in some cases, yes. But it's more about recognizing those instincts that might actually hold you back.
I see. So when you're first learning to ski, you kind of want to lean back, which is like the worst thing you can do.
Exactly. So what are some of those lean back instincts we need to unlearn in the startup world?
Well, he tells this funny story about Y Combinator, the startup accelerator he co-founded.
Yeah, I know Y Combinator.
So he says it often felt like their main job was to warn founders about these classic mistakes they're about to make.
Classic mistakes, meaning?
Mistakes those founders would then go on to make anyway, despite being warned.
Like they had to learn the hard way.
It's almost that they had to see for themselves.
So it's almost like the advice is more valuable because it goes against our initial instincts.
Yeah, we might not even realize we're doing these things wrong without someone like Graham pointing them out.
Okay, that makes sense. So he's not saying to ignore your instincts entirely.
No, actually, he highlights one area where he believes your gut feeling is absolutely crucial. Choosing your co-founders.
That's huge. Your co-founders are like your partners in crime. You're going to be spending a lot of time with these people.
Under a lot of pressure. Yeah, that relationship has got to be solid from the get-go.
Absolutely. And he's got very specific advice about this. He says, pick your co-founders the same way you'd pick your friends.
People you genuinely like. People you respect.
And ideally, people you've known long enough to really trust.
Exactly. And this is especially important for engineers, he says.
How so?
Well, they might be tempted to, overlook certain distasteful behaviors, like, oh, that's just how business is done.
Yeah, I can see that, like separating the personal from the professional.
But Graham says no. Good people are good people, period. Don't compromise on that.
That's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the hustle and think you need to be ruthless to succeed.
But building a company is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
You want people you can actually stand to be around for the long haul.
And speaking of misconceptions, Graham tackles this myth that you need to be like a startup expert to build a successful company.
Ah, yes. He uses Mark Zuckerberg as an example. When Zuckerberg started Facebook.
Facebook, yeah. Hard to imagine him as anything but a tech giant now.
Well, back then, he was, in Graham's words, a complete noob when it came to the actual mechanics of running a startup.
So what he's saying is it's not about having all the answers right away. It's more about...
It's about understanding your users. That's far more valuable than, just being a startup expert.
Expertise in your users versus expertise in the startup process itself.
Right. And he actually warns against getting too caught up in the process.
How so?
Well, he says it can lead to this thing he calls playing house.
Playing house.
It's like mimicking the actions of a startup without actually creating something people want. You're focused on the image rather than the substance.
Ah, so it's like in school, sometimes you're rewarded for just going through the motions, reading the assigned chapters, hitting deadlines.
But in the startup world, it's about building something real, solving real problems, not just going through the motions.
Okay, makes sense. Now, Graham doesn't sugarcoat things. He's very upfront about how demanding startup life can be.
Oh, yeah. He compares it to having kids.
Whoa, big commitment.
He describes it as like a button you press that irrevocably changes your life. No going back.
So it's not something you do in your spare time after your 9 to 5?
Definitely not. He uses this phrase, Larry Page running.
Larry Page running.
It's a way to describe that constant, always-on mentality.
Yeah.
Nonstop demands, no breaks.
Sounds intense.
And there's no sympathy, even if you're, a billionaire with problems.
Okay, that raises the question, how do you even know if you're cut out for that kind of life?
That's what I'd want to know.
Right, it's like, am I startup material?
Well, Graham's answer is, you can't really know until you try.
So just jump in and see what happens.
He says the very act of starting a company changes you. You adapt and evolve as you go through those challenges.
Makes sense. So don't let uncertainty hold you back.
But maybe, as Graham jokes, don't jump in at age 20.
Wait, why not? He thinks that time is better spent exploring, maybe traveling, pursuing those crazy side projects that might seem like dead ends, but could spark something incredible.
Okay, so speaking of side projects, Graham has some counterintuitive advice about finding those winning startup ideas.
Yeah.
He says don't try to force them.
Don't force them. How do you just not force them?
Well, his suggestion is to cultivate a mind that generates ideas unconsciously.
Unconsciously. Like in your sleep?
Not literally, but, those side projects we were just talking about, they can play a huge role.
Okay, starting to see the connection.
Think about it. Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Apple, so many iconic companies started as side projects.
It's almost like they were born out of pure curiosity and passion.
And that's exactly the point Graham is making.
So how do you cultivate that kind of mind, the kind that's constantly generating ideas?
He emphasizes learning about things that truly matter, working on problems that genuinely fascinate you, and surrounding yourself with inspiring people.
And that loops back to finding those awesome co-founders, right? Absolutely. Remember Airbnb?
The guys who basically turned their apartment into a hotel.
Yeah. The founders weren't tech wizards. They were design experts. They were incredible at bringing people together and getting things done.
So your expertise doesn't have to be purely technical.
It's about finding something that stretches you, something you're truly curious about.
Okay, so curiosity seems to be a key theme here.
Absolutely. And it leads us to Graham's concept of living in the future.
Living in the future. Sounds kind of sci-fi.
Well, he describes technology as spreading, like, get this, a fractal stain.
A fractal stain. I'm picturing something out of a chemistry lab.
Okay, maybe not the most elegant analogy, but his point is every edge of that stain represents a new opportunity.
New opportunity for
innovation, for disruption, for creating something totally new. He encourages us to immerse ourselves in cutting-edge tech, to be at that forefront where those groundbreaking ideas become obvious.
I'm listening.
And to illustrate this, he tells a great story about a grad student who built his own VoIP software.
VoIP, like voice over IP, for making calls over the internet.
Yep. And why did he build it? Just so he could call his girlfriend in Taiwan for free? Practical.
It wasn't meant to be a startup. It was just a solution to a problem that seemed obvious to him because he was living at the edge of that technology.
It's like he saw the opportunity before anyone else did, just by being curious and trying to solve a problem in his own life.
Exactly. And that totally ties back to following your curiosity.
It can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
Totally. And when it comes down to it, Graham's biggest piece of advice for aspiring founders boils down to two simple words. Just learn.
Just learn. Sounds almost too simple.
I know, right? But he argues that a classic liberal arts education, the kind that emphasizes broad knowledge and intellectual curiosity, might be the best preparation for the startup world.
Really? Not like a specialized business degree.
He actually uses himself as an example.
Yeah.
He wishes he'd studied physics.
It's not about acquiring specific skills. It's about nurturing that inner drive to explore and understand the world around you.
I'm seeing a pattern here.
That curiosity, that's the foundation for everything that follows.
So are we ready to jump into that Q&A portion of his lecture? I'm sure there's even more gold to be mined there.
Absolutely. Let's hear what questions people threw at him and how he applied these principles to real-world scenarios. Okay, so now we're getting into the Q&A section of Graham's talk. This is where things get really interesting. We see how he applies these broad principles to very specific situations.
Love the Q&A. Always where the real gems come out.
Absolutely. And the first question is one that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. It comes from someone who's not a technical founder.
So not a programmer, not an engineer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're wondering, how can I best contribute to a tech-heavy startup?
It's a common question. There's this perception that you need to be a coding whiz to make it in the startup world.
Right. Like if you can't code, are you even relevant? So what does Graham have to say about that?
Well, he explains that it really depends on the specific startup. If the company's operating in a very specific domain, like Uber did with the limo business.
Okay, so a very niche area where specialized knowledge is valuable.
Exactly. In those cases, the non-technical founder's expertise can be absolutely crucial. Like, they could be the one handling driver recruitment, understanding the regulations, all that stuff.
So the technical founder builds the app, But there's a whole world of other challenges that need to be addressed.
100%. But then he goes on to say, if it's a purely technical startup, like one that's all about the algorithm, the software itself,
Yeah.
then, well, he jokes that the non-technical founder might be mostly there for the coffee runs and cheeseburger deliveries.
Ah, I can just imagine. Got to keep those programmers fueled up.
Right. Okay, so next question. This is a big one. Someone asks about business school.
Is it worth it if you're an aspiring entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's the question. And Graham, well, he doesn't hold back. He basically says no.
No, to business school. Why not?
Because he explains, most business schools are designed to teach management. And management is really a problem you face only once your startup is already successful.
You're not exactly managing a huge team when you're just starting out.
You're building a product. You're figuring out if there's even a market for it. Those early days are all about hustle and scrappiness.
So his argument is you're better off learning by doing.
Exactly. He actually says, just start the damn thing.
There's that action-oriented approach again. And he even admits that he used to advise people to work for a few years before starting a company. But now
He's changed his mind. He thinks you actually learn faster by just jumping in head first.
there's no substitute for that real-world experience. You can't simulate the pressure of building something from scratch.
Speaking of real-world pressure, get this. The next question is about whether we're in a bubble.
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Everyone wants to know, are those sky-high valuations we're seeing in the startup world sustainable?
What does Graham think?
He's got a very nuanced perspective, as always. He acknowledges that, yeah, prices are high. But he makes a distinction between high prices and an actual bubble.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
So a bubble, in Graham's definition, is when people are knowingly paying inflated prices, hoping to unload their assets onto someone else, the greater fool, before everything crashes.
Like a game of hot potato, but with millions of dollars at stake.
Exactly. And he doesn't think that's what's happening right now. He says, yes, valuations are high, but it's not driven by that kind of, speculative frenzy.
So he doesn't see a bubble. But does that mean we shouldn't be cautious?
I mean, it's always wise to be prudent. Don't assume that fundraising will always be easy.
Good advice. Always plan for the worst-case scenario.
Okay, next question. This one's interesting. Someone brings up this trend of entrepreneurs who want to start not just one company, but 20.
Whoa, 20. What's the thinking behind that?
They're launching these things called labs, essentially designed to spin off multiple startups.
Like a startup factory.
Pretty much. And Graham, he finds it fascinating. He even mentions that Twitter actually started that way, as a side project within a podcasting company.
No way. Twitter.
Yep, so it can work. But he cautions that, it requires a ton of resources.
Yeah, you're essentially spreading your bets across multiple ventures.
Right. And not every lab is going to hit a home run.
All right, on to a really important topic. Gender bias in the startup world. A woman in the audience asks for advice on navigating fundraising as a female co-founder.
This is where Graham's, pragmatism really comes through. He acknowledges that, yeah, women might face additional challenges when it comes to raising capital, but he kind of doubles down on his core advice.
Which is?
Make your startup perform exceptionally well. He believes that a stellar growth graph, those numbers that show your company is taking off, those transcend gender.
So it's about letting your results speak for themselves.
Exactly. Focus on building a successful company and the funding will follow.
Love that. Okay, for a later question, someone asked Graham what he would study if he were in college today.
He starts off joking about literary theory, but then he gets serious and says, probably physics.
Physics. Interesting.
Yeah, he feels like he kind of missed out on that subject. He's drawn to it now.
And that brings us back to his point about following your curiosity.
Right. You never know where it might lead you.
It might seem irrelevant to your startup goals, but that intellectual exploration can spark unexpected connections down the road. Okay, another question. This one's about productivity. How does someone like Graham, who's obviously juggling a million things, stay on top of it all?
Well, his answer to this one is surprisingly relatable. He says, having kids.
Kids, that'll teach you time management skills.
His point is, parenthood forces you to focus because you simply don't have time to waste. He also talks about two main modes of work.
Okay, what are those?
Forced and voluntary. So he compares going through Y Combinator applications to a deadline, something that forces him to buckle down and focus.
Gotta hit that deadline.
While writing essays, that's something he does voluntarily, almost like a creative compulsion.
So it's about finding that balance between, external pressures and that internal drive.
Right. And he emphasizes that when you're working on something you genuinely love, efficiency often takes care of itself.
Okay, remember that whole discussion about side projects? Someone asks a very important question. How do you know when it's time to turn that side project into a full-blown startup?
His answer, you'll know.
That's it. Just you'll know.
He says, it's when that project starts taking over your life, when you find yourself pushing aside other responsibilities because you're so consumed by this one thing, it takes on a life of its own.
Okay, that makes sense. What about when you're already working on a startup? It's growing, but not explosively. How do you know whether to stick with it or cut your losses?
Oh, this is a good one. Graham playfully calls out the listener for not doing their homework. He actually refers back to one of his essays, Do Things That Don't Scale.
I love that he's holding the audience accountable.
He basically says, that essay addresses this exact question. Go read it. But essentially, even when growth seems slow, there are strategic actions you can take.
Actions to get things moving in the right direction.
Exactly. Okay, next question. Someone wants to know what types of startups should not go through an incubator like Y Combinator.
I'm curious, what's his take on that?
Well, he mentions failing startups, of course. But he also throws in this funny caveat. Startups with intolerable founders.
So personality does matter in the startup world. It's not just about the idea, it's about the people behind it.
Absolutely. But he also emphasizes that, surprisingly, a lot of startup challenges are actually universal.
Yeah.
Regardless of what specific industry you're in or what product you're building.
So the basic principles still apply.
Right. And that's where incubators can really shine. They can help you navigate those common challenges.
Learn from the collective experience of people who have been there before.
Exactly. And finally, someone brings us back to that idea of things that matter. Remember Graham's analogy of technology spreading like a fractal stain, with each edge being an opportunity?
Yeah, how do you know which edges are worth exploring?
He admits he doesn't have a perfect answer. He kind of circles back to his advice about, pursue what you find genuinely interesting.
But how do you know it's truly interesting?
Right, that's the tricky part. But he does offer this one little clue. He says, if you find boring tasks utterly intolerable, that might be a sign that you have a natural affinity for, like genuinely interesting problems.
It's about that inherent restlessness, that need to constantly challenge yourself.
And that's a perfect segue into his closing thoughts for this lecture.
Okay, so after that whirlwind Q&A, tons of great insights there. How does Paul Graham wrap things up? What's his final message to all those aspiring entrepreneurs out there?
He keeps circling back to this simple but powerful idea. Just learn. It's all about constantly expanding your knowledge, seeking out new information, and being a lifelong learner.
And how does that translate to the startup world specifically?
He really emphasizes the importance of domain expertise, like becoming a true expert in whatever area your startup is focused on. And he believes the best way to develop that expertise is, you guessed it, through genuine curiosity.
So not about chasing the latest trends.
Nope. It's about immersing yourself in something that you're truly passionate about, becoming a master of your domain. And he uses Larry Page, the Google guy.
Of course, yeah.
Page's deep understanding of search was the foundation for Google's success. And all stemmed from his own intellectual curiosity, his desire to really understand how search works.
It's a great reminder that sometimes the best startup ideas don't come from some calculated business plan. They emerge organically from a place of deep knowledge and passion.
That's it. And Graham actually leaves us with this really thought-provoking idea. He says that starting a startup, at its best, is simply an ulterior motive for curiosity.
An ulterior motive for curiosity. I like that. It's like you're not just starting a company to make money or become famous.
It's about pursuing something that genuinely fascinates you. And the startup becomes a way to express that passion and hopefully share it with the world.
So as we resurface from this deep dive into Paul Graham's wisdom, what's the big takeaway? What's that one nugget of insight that we should all hold on to?
For me, it's the reminder that a startup founder's journey is really a journey of lifelong learning. It's about nurturing that curiosity, embracing the unknown, and trusting that the path will unfold as you go.
Beautifully said. And who knows, maybe that path will lead you to create something truly groundbreaking, something that changes the world.
And even if it doesn't, the pursuit itself will be an incredibly rewarding experience.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and maybe we'll see you out there in the startup world someday.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.